Well, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to have you at the university this evening, and it's so good that so many of you managed to come. Many friends and supporters, and these events when we introduce our new professors to the community, it's always lovely to see people from all the faculties here, and even a former rector, and a former High Sheriff, and the present High Sheriff too, who I look forward to meeting just now, and of course the Archbishop I saw somewhere, indeed, and the Pro-Chancellor, Monsignor John Devine, and so many others. It's always good to see the family of our professors join us, and we have the Cottrell Boyce clan with us, or part of them at least, and of course Mrs. Cottrell Boyce with us as well. So very welcome. I would have loved to have said on this fine summer's evening, but having lived here now for 9 years, I know each day is not unlike the South Island in New Zealand, a bit of a lottery. We meet in the Senate room of the university, where we are actually in one of the two chapels of the university, and it's here that the university's most important decisions are made and where the Senate sits. We also use this place for important events like this, and we consider the inaugural lectures of our professors to be one such important event. And there's a growing tradition at this university that our professors are launched properly, but also we hear what they seek to profess at this university. This evening's event is to announce with great joy the appointment of Dr. Frank Cottrell Boyce as a professor of this university, and Professor Cottrell Boyce will be attached to the Department of Media and Communications and partly attached to the Faculty of Education. And the reason why is in Media and Communications, of course, because he's a famous writer and, as you know, for many films, and greatly involved in the upcoming launch of the Olympics and its programming. So a distinguished Liverpool scholar. But you may not be aware of why we're also associating this chair partly with the Faculty of Education. And that's simply because he's a great patron of an organization I've come to admire greatly, the Reader Organization. Dr. Davis is here. I did see her, yes, indeed, who founded and heads that organization. The Reader Organization is involved with the faculty in a formal way, because this organization, like our professor tonight, is passionate about reading. And not just reading, but reading for the sheer joy of it. Now, I think that's a great, great vision to have for a culture that's become visual and less textual. And for a culture, sadly, because of television and other more immediate tablet technology, our expansion, our attention rates have been restricted to little sound bites, so much so that even our news, sadly, is written in that superficial way. So to restore reading for the love of reading is a marvelous passion of our professor tonight, which I hope you'll refer to at some point, because he's a great patron of this organization. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the university, and welcome to this great celebration of yet another new professor at our university. Our university makes intellectual and academic strides on various fronts regularly, and we're very pleased to have professors of this distinction. I'm going to invite the academic pro-vice-chancellor, Professor Newport, to come forward, please, and formally introduce our speaker tonight. Professor Newport.
Well, good evening. It's been a very great pleasure of mine to have had the opportunity to introduce, I think, 30 or more professorial lectures here at Liverpool Hope over the past few years. And a noticeable feature has been the way in which the lectures and the professors that have been appointed have highlighted the geographical spread from which they are drawn. We've got professors from many parts of the world, including the United States, several actually from the United States and India, from New Zealand, and from Germany, and from many other places as well. Well, our worldwide search can even extend as far as Liverpool. And I'm sure it comes as no surprise when I say that here too, in Liverpool, and not just on further flung shores, we've been able to locate the high level of real expertise that we have been looking for in our professorial appointments. And such is certainly the case with our inaugural lecturer this evening, Professor Frank Cottrell Boyce. Professor Cottrell Boyce is a son of the city, undertook graduate studies at Keble College in Oxford and also completed a doctorate at the same university. Working first as a literary critic, he quickly became an eminent and widely acclaimed screenwriter, working on such staples of the British TV diet as Brookside and Coronation Street. It was, however, an enormously fruitful partnership with filmmaker Michael Winterbottom that set Professor Cottrell Boyce so firmly on the screenwriter's map. The partnership led to a number of films, many of which I'm sure are known to those in this audience this evening, including Butterfly Kiss, Welcome to Sarajevo, The Claim, 24-Hour Party People, and several others as well. And from there, Professor Cottrell Boyce moved on to work with a number of other filmmakers. In 1998, the hugely successful film Hilary and Jackie appeared, based upon the life of cellist Jacqueline du Pré. The film was made entirely, actually, here in Liverpool and was greeted with huge critical acclaim. All of the awards and nominations it attracted are simply, I'm afraid, too numerous to note here in any detail. Suffice it to say that it was nominated for 2 leading Oscars and 5 BAFTAs. Also shot here in Liverpool was the film Millions, directed by Academy Award-winning director Danny Boyle. And it too achieved a status and rank within the industry, and greeted again with great acclaim by Professor Boyce's peers. With the screenplay winning the British Independent Film Award. However, this film, Millions, was not just written by Professor Boyce in terms of its in terms of its film script, because Professor Boyce was also responsible for the book from which the film was an adaptation, his own children's novel of the same name. And it was the book that won the Carnegie Medal in 2004. Professor Boyce has written also a number of other novels. These include The Unforgotten Coat, Famed, and Cosmic, also shortlisted for the Carnegie Medal. In 2011, Professor Cottrell Boyce was commissioned to write a sequel to Ian Fleming's children's book, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which was published as Chitty Chitty Bang Bang Flies Again. And his work continues. Professor Cottrell Boyce is currently working as part of a creative team for the opening games of the Olympic ceremony, the opening of the Olympic Games, and in addition has a film in production based upon Eric Lomax's memoir of forgiveness on the Burman Railway entitled The Railway Man. Well, as Professor Pile has indicated, Professor Cottrell Boyce has a very strong interest in reading and comes to us as Professor of Reading and Communication, which is a carefully crafted title that sums up his passion for both of those things. A concern for effective communication, be that via the screen or through the written word, surely lies at the heart of the kind of activity to which Professor Cottrell Boyce has demonstrated such commitment over the last many years, and to which he has contributed in such significant ways. And we are truly delighted to have Professor Boyce with us as part of our university community. Well, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang may be flying again, and I'm sure that we will also soon be flying again as we are treated to this last in our present series of the academic professorial lectures here at Liverpool Hope University. So I invite now Professor Frank Cottrell Boyce to deliver his lecture to us on the subject, Where Do Great Ideas Come From? Professor Boyce.
You have to indulge me for a minute. I've always wanted to do this, like Will Hay. Yeah, can you all hear me? It's good. There are three questions that, if I go to a school or to a book festival, there are three questions that I know for a fact that children are going to ask me. They are you famous? That's the first one. How much do you earn? Every single time, how much do you earn? And where do ideas come from? And after that, it sort of gets a bit less predictable. I've had, how much do you weigh? And there was a girl in Adlington a few weeks ago who had her hand up like this, and she was like, I thought, well, that's obviously a good question. She was very keen. She was pushing her hand up, and she actually used this hand to pull this hand up higher. And I thought, well, I'll come to her at the end, because that's obviously a good question. But in fact, she started to sort of self-asphyxiate with excitement, so out of mercy, I had to say to her, so what's your question? And she said, have you ever ate a nettle? And her teacher, I'd said to her teacher, who'd asked me to come in, yeah, I'll come in, but I'm not going to do worksheets or workshops or anything like that. This is like, my thing is reading for pleasure. That's what I believe in, that's my campaign, that's what I'm here for. He went, absolutely, I totally get that. And then he introduced me to the class like this. He said, it's great, Frank is here, he's going to read to us, and we're going to use our listening skills to listen out for his wow words and his connectives. So I thought, well, we've all got different definitions of pleasure. I did imagine him going out. I was kind of imagining him at supper that night with his girlfriend, saying, and here we've got proteins, good, carbs, bad, and you're going to use your listening skills to listen to me. And she'd be sitting there thinking, yeah, but did he ever eat a nettle? So we've all got different definitions of pleasure, and pleasure is what I'm sort of here to talk about, and the answer to the question is, I think, where do great ideas come from, is pleasure. But I thought about, because those kids like who ask you, where do great ideas come from? I thought, I have to think about this. We need great ideas. Why do we skip that question? Because we do skip that question. There's a stock in trade among writers who go to festivals and schools of smart aleck kind of evasive answers. Most people use the Douglas Adams gambit, which is, I get my ideas from a small out-of-town retail unit near Swindon called Ideas Are Us. And a lot of people use the Bernard O'Donoghue answer, which is, if I knew where ideas came from, I'd go there more often. He's not the only one, but I've just noticed this quote that I wrote out here. This is great. That teacher isn't the only one who kind of has that reductive view of pleasure. This is from an internet review, an Amazon review of a book. If you search for the typical writing strategies for key stage 1 and 2, such as wow words and connectives, which I do when trying to demonstrate to my 7-year-old how authors tell a good story, they were seriously lacking. I was, needless to say, disappointed. That's a review of Millions by me, by the way. So we all have different definitions of pleasure. So where do ideas come from? And writers will happily answer where an idea comes from. We'll tell you where an idea comes from. Writers will say, oh, I dreamed it, or it really happened to me, or I saw something that inspired me, I saw a lord, I saw some rings, I put them together, it was obvious, that type of thing. And it's not just writers, that kind of goes back to the beginning of intellectual endeavour. If you think of Archimedes sitting in his bath and seeing the water displace and then running naked into the street shouting Eureka. If you think of Newton sitting in the orchard getting the apple on his head. If you think of Darwin reading Malthus and having these wow moments when these kind of ideas come in, we'll tell those stories. And what all those stories have in common is that they're a lie. They're all lies. None of those stories is true. And I thought, well, why do we feel the need to tell those stories, those ridiculous stories about apples and baths? And I think this, in some ways, it's highly understandable. It's partly that when you get to a great idea, when you arrive finally at a great idea, it is very simple. It is always simple. The great ideas seem very simple, very clear, almost self-evident. And it's therefore incredibly embarrassing to stand up in front of people and tell you how long it took to get to that point. For Newton to say, yes, every action's got an equal opposite reaction, but for years, I thought just some actions had a kind of equal-ish reaction, and I was kind of working on that. Or, even from the level of great physics theories down to lines of poetry, nobody wants to have to say, I'm really glad you liked it. Would you believe that in the first draft, it was a cow I wandered lonely as? Nobody wants to do that because it takes so long to arrive at simplicity. So we have a psychological need to say it just came really. So I'm talking from deep pain here. I'm in the middle of shooting a film which has taken me 13 years to bring to the screen. I wrote the first draft 13 years ago. It's based on this beautiful book by Eric Lomax called The Railway Man. And it's about a soldier who fought on the Burma Railway, and when he came home, his mother was already dead, and he'd been tortured, and it was awful. And he never really kind of settled back into life, and he went back to Japan to try and confront his demons. And it's 13 years ago since I wrote this first draft. And we've worked really hard on it. And then last week, we got a phone call saying the actress playing the man's wife, who signed up and done lots and lots of publicity and is there in situ. He's a massive Hollywood star. It's Nicole Kidman. Phoned up and said, I don't really want to go to Japan at the end. It's like, okay, because that's where the third act happens. Right. And so I had to rush up to the shoot and sit and work on the top deck of a bus where I did all my best homework, the catering bus, where I sat on the top deck of the bus and rewrote it and found this beautiful, beautiful ending. You know, this is a man who'd had a terrible homecoming in the middle of the war, at the end of the war, and then finally, now, he has this beautiful homecoming at the end of the film in Berwick-on-Tweed, where Nicole is quite happy to shoot. And when you watch the film, it will seem overwhelmingly obvious and perfect, and that ending. It's just exactly the right ending. Almost like too simple, too obvious, that ending. 13 years it took us to get to that ending. 13 years of not getting that ending. So there's that, there's the embarrassment factor. And there's also, in our day and age, the intellectual copyright. You know, we live in a world of intellectual ownership and intellectual copyright. So you come up with these Genesis stories in order to prove your ownership of an idea. Because you can't anymore say, you know, I went to university, a lot of us were talking about social networking, we shared ideas, we stole each other's ideas, we pooled each other's ideas, we listened, we talked. You can't say that, that's going to cost you £1 billion. You've got to say, you know, I saw a face, I saw a book, I put them together, it was obvious. You've got to come up with your story for that. So, because we have this need to kind of come up with it, for various reasons, to come up with these Genesis stories for ideas, I think we've obscured where ideas really come from. Where did they really come from? How do ideas really arrive? And we've come up with this kind of iconography of men lounging in orchards or baths and being visited by these fantastic notions. So I thought I wanted to challenge that this evening. And I thought I would take you through the genesis of a really great idea. I mean, a really fantastic idea. And it could be anything. It could be Tupperware. It could be sonnets. It could be bioengineering. It could be, I could have chosen anything. But because we're in Liverpool, I've chosen the most important idea to come out of Liverpool from the greatest creative mind that I think we've ever had in Liverpool. And I'm talking about a young man called Jeremiah Horrocks, who was born in Otterspool in 1618. And now Otterspool is this beautiful promenade, but then it would have been just kind of, at low tide it would have been this vast mud flat, and at high tide it would have been this big brown lagoon. And he was a farmer's son, and he had an uncle who was a clockmaker. And Jeremiah went to Cambridge, he went to Emmanuel College, Cambridge. So it's always quite difficult to read social class off hundreds of years later. But he went to Cambridge, so obviously he was sort of very bright and had support. But he went as a sizar, which is someone who works as a servant while they're at the college. So he had to sort of chop wood and wait on tables, and they wore a different kind of gown, so people knew what they were. And he studied theology. He wanted to take holy orders, and that remained his kind of overwhelming passion through his life. But while he was at Cambridge, he had access to this amazing new learning, this fantastic data about astronomy, which was his other great love. So he was able to read Kepler and Copernicus properly for the first time, and also to have access to Landsberg's tables, which talk about the movement of the stars and the planets and predict planetary motion. And he was fascinated by this, and as a teenage sort of semi-servant, he looked at this stuff and thought, this is all fantastic, and Kepler's brilliant, and it's all right, but the maths is wrong. He just thought, the maths is wrong. So he started to kind of rework the maths. And without being too, I don't want to go into too much detail, but Kepler had put together these tables of planetary motion in about 1627, and he had predicted a transit of Venus, that's the passage of Venus across the face of the sun between us and the Earth in 1631. But it would be in the southern hemisphere, no one in Europe would be able to see it. And then he thought there wouldn't be another one till 1761. So there'll be these two passages of Venus across the face of the sun. But Jeremiah looked at these maths and thought, this is wrong. There's going to be another one in 1639. It'll be great. And I can't wait. You know, he was incredibly excited about this. So he went down from Cambridge, he finished his degree. He didn't go to London and become a lawyer or a courtier or anything like that. He went back to Otterspool. Via Manchester, he went to Manchester first of all and spent 2 shillings and sixpence, which I think was probably an enormous amount of money, on a telescope. And from then on, he took nightly observations of planetary motion. And people didn't really do this. People had done it. Tycho Brahe had done it about 50 years before, in the 1570s. He had done it, but Tycho Brahe, I don't know if people know, this is a side issue, but I like to talk about Tycho Brahe because he's a great guy. He was a fantastic astronomer and a great blagger, and he blagged the King of Denmark out of an enormous amount of money and bought had a little sort of city built for himself for sky observation called Uraniborg, and he had 100 people working there watching planetary motion. He also had a golden nose because he'd had his nose cut off in a duel. And a measure of the man is that his pet elk died. He had a pet elk, and it died when it fell downstairs because it was drunk. Right? So he took his elk upstairs, got it drunk, and it fell downstairs and died. So that's Tycho, and that's a world away from Jeremiah with his 2 and 6 penny telescope, standing out in Otterspool, looking at the stars, and writing to his friend George Crabtree in Altrincham, who was a cloth merchant, and they wrote to each other about what they saw. They wrote to each other most days about what they'd seen overnight. And nobody had really done night-by-night observations since the incredibly well-resourced Tycho and his elk had done it in the 1570s. And night after night after night, Jeremiah saw that the maths was wrong, that Kepler's maths was wrong. He'd had professors at Cambridge who were professors of astronomy. I think they'd probably gone out and done bits of astronomy every now and then, but if it didn't kind of tie up with the tables, they just probably thought, well, my hand was a bit shaky, or they didn't really sort of really re-engage with it experimentally. The only person in the world doing that at this time was Jeremiah Horrocks. And as 1639 got closer and closer, he thought, I am right. There is going to be this transit of the sun, and the transit of Venus across the sun, and it's going to be amazing. So this is sort of what everything was leading up to. And on November the 29th, 1639, that's the date that he predicted for this transit of Venus, he woke up and it was cloudy, really cloudy, and it was Sunday, so he was really busy because he was in sort of minor orders at this point. So it couldn't have been worse, really. He said, I had business of the highest import, which for these ornamental pursuits I could not with propriety neglect. So it's like, this is going to happen in 1639. It's not going to happen again till 1761, when I'll have been dead 100 years by then. This is my day. And it's cloudy. It's cloudy. And at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, this amazing thing happened. I love this paragraph. I read it a lot. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the clouds, as if by divine interposition, were entirely dispersed, and I was invited to the grateful task of my observations, and I beheld a most agreeable spectacle. The object of my sanguine wishes, I could not have wished for a more extended period. And this is what he saw. This is his drawing. This is what he saw. He saw tiny Venus moving across the face of the sun. He saw this amazing thing. He saw our solar system moving. An amazing thing with his 2 and 6 penny telescope. And the only other person in the whole world who saw it was Crabtree over in Altrincham. And they wrote to each other about it. And this is the first scientific observation of the transit of Venus. And from it flow all kinds of amazing things. It's the first, well, first of all, it proved that his maths was right, and that therefore his drawings about the kind of nature of orbit, these elliptical orbits that he'd imagined were right. So it's an amazing thing. It's the first time anyone could prove that planets weren't self-luminescent. It's clearly just not glowing. It comes from the the glow that you see on a planet comes from the sun. It's the first time anyone proved that. And tons and tons of data come from this little quarter of an hour that he chiseled out of an afternoon in Much Hoole near Preston, which is where he was at the time. And I think about that quarter of an hour a lot. It's an amazing thing. And then the quarter of an hour was over, and what did he do? He carried on making these observations. In particular, he got obsessed with observing the moon and the planets. And he started to notice these amazing things. He started to notice that Jupiter was speeding up and Venus was slowing down. He couldn't think why that would be. And he started to notice a relationship between the moon and the tides. And he was bumping up against naming some force. What is this force that makes things move around each other, but makes them seem to slow down when they get near each other? What is that force? And he didn't know what the name of that force was because the apple hadn't fallen on Newton's head yet. He didn't know what that was. But he kind of compiled this data excitedly and wrote to his friend and was out every night with his telescope. And then in 1641, he died. He was 22 years old. And so this is the Keats of astronomy. It's an amazing thing. 1641. And shortly after that, England is convulsed with civil war. There's this massive disruption to all aspects of our life, but particularly to, well, not particularly, but also to intellectual life. So everything was sort of almost lost, really. But Crabtree kept these notes and passed them around to people. And I've got to check my dates here. And he was constantly sort of passing them to other people and reading them out to other people. In 1662, they were picked up by the great Polish astronomer Helevius, who published them in Latin in Poland. And from there, they finally got their way back to the Royal Society in 1660, which is like 20 years after he died. Newton came upon them, and they were like an apple falling on your head. They were the missing part of Newton's jigsaw. And Newton did talk about an apple falling on his head, but he also said this beautiful thing in the beginning of In Principia, which is in 1687. It's 40-odd years. It's two of Jeremiah's lifetimes after Jeremiah died. Newton finally wrote the In Principia, which he outlines the general theory of gravity. And he says, I feel that I stood on the shoulders of giants. And, of course, the giants were Kepler and Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and his elk. But there were also this teenager with his 2 6" telescope. And that teenage boy from Otterspool, that's one of the giants on whose shoulders Newton stood. And I think that's an amazing story. And I think about that story a lot, and I think about that quarter of an hour a lot. And think, well, what does it tell us about where ideas come from, that story? And this is a major idea, gravity, right? And what does it tell us about the way in which these major, major ideas come together? And there's like a few little things that I'd like to say first of all. First of all, there's no element of competition in this story, right? Competition doesn't come into this. Competition everywhere that I've looked in human culture, competition is always and everywhere the enemy of innovation. Competition can sharpen your knife, but it's never ever going to invent a knife. And it's never going to turn up to the knife sharpening Olympics and go, what do you think of that? I'm going to call it a fork. That's never going to happen. And you can prove that if you look at, in trivial examples, if you look at what the Best Picture Oscar has gone to, or what the Booker Prize goes to. Those awards start as going to kind of the best book of the year or the best film of the year, and then as the years go by, they become a genre. And now you know that the Best Picture Oscar is going to go to something about someone who's overcome some difficulty, whether it's a physical ailment or a social problem, and you'll definitely get it if you stick the Holocaust in there, or a stutter, or a limp, or anything like that. You can kind of put together an Oscar film. Hopefully it's going to be called The Railway Man. The other thing is, there's no particular aims and objectives. There's no aims and objectives to what Jeremiah was doing. It's a very, very open-ended process. He calls it an ornamental pursuit. When he's watched this thing that he's waited for all this time, he moves straight across to watching the moon. I think he just liked having a telescope. I think he just liked being out with a telescope. And he let the telescope lead him where it wanted to go, and it led to Newton, and it led to gravity, and from Newton we get the Industrial Revolution, all from this teenager with a telescope, which is where I think it starts. So there's no particular aim and objective. Inspiration isn't in there. That's another thing. We've talked about those moments of inspiration. But in Jeremiah's story, there is no moment of inspiration. And I think that's because I think inspiration is very real. I think it's a real thing. And I think, you felt it. I felt it on the top deck of the bus outside North Queensferry the other day. But it comes at the end, inspiration. I think people have this map of inspiration that it's the sort of the key and the starter motor. You get your moment of inspiration and then you're off. But I think by and large, it seems to come at the end of the process. After you've sweated, after you've been embarrassed, after you've spent 13 years doing rubbish drafts and things like that, that's when your inspiration comes in. And, after you've written I Wandered Lonely as a Cow, the inspiration will take you to I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud. A really terrific example that I know about this is that Paul McCartney had the beautiful tune for Yesterday, years and years and years before he could think of a lyric for it. And he carried it round with him, knowing that it would come, having faith that there would be a day when the inspiration would come. He carried that tune, and he would remember that tune by singing Scrambled Eggs, oh my baby, how I love your legs, which isn't really worthy of the tune, is it? But he kept hold of it, and you keep hold of it. I think that's the thing. What else? It can take a long time for a great idea to come. 1687 is a long time after Jeremiah was standing out at Otterspool with his telescope. It takes a long time for these things to crystallize. And that's something else that we don't take into account. These things take a long time. And therefore, thinking about there's no competition, there's no money, obviously, there's no aims and objectives. How do you keep something together without those satisfactions, without money, without praise, without the little satisfactions that come from setting yourself aims and objectives? What is it that keeps someone with that tune in their head, with that possibility in their head, over that long period of time? What is that force that keeps you thinking, keeps something in your head while it moves around like that? And I want to call that pleasure. When we talk about pleasure in reading, I want to call that pleasure. And pleasure is something different from fun, and it's something different from distraction. Pleasure, I think, is a really profound form of attention, a really deep, deep way of thinking. It's a way of keeping something in your mind a very long time, in a very open-ended way, and not asking anything of it. And only pleasure will allow you to bring the full complexity of your mind to bear on something. We talk a lot about mental processes in education and in the work that I do, and it's always fairly reductive. It's always like you need reason, or you need ambition, or you need drive, or you need focus. But actually, the great ideas, I think, and the great ideas have come from people who've been able to just look at what the different aspects of himself that are at work in Jeremiah's study. There's nostalgia. I think there's a lot of nostalgia in that. I think, from a kid, he has seen that tide come in and change that mudflat into a lagoon. And that's the rhythm. There's some celestial rhythm that felt very close to him, I think. There's his religious faith, an enormously important part, He said, by divine interposition. He really felt, as a scientist, that the reason he would pay attention to celestial movement is that it was speaking to him, that he was in a conversation with it, that nature was a book of revelation. I think the novelty of the telescope is a huge thing to him. I think he loved playing with that telescope. I think the friendship of Crabtree is another massive thing to him. I think maybe he just didn't have a lot to do is another thing, which is a very, very important factor, not having too much to do. All those different things. But we always talk as though our mind, there's one aspect of our mind which is more important than the other, whether it's our reason or logic or ambition or focus. And in fact, our mind is myriad. My wife Denise said it's like a million faceted diamond in which we're just taking one facet and making it huge. But we need to be able to use all those different facets. David Eagleman, the neurobiologist, calls the brain a team of rivals. Our consciousness is only one element in that team. And pleasure is, so your brain is like, it's this, popped into my head, inspirational moment. It's like those massive flocks of starlings that you see, which change shape and move and kind of boil and spread out and disappear and come back. They have this kind of boiling shape to them, but something is keeping them together. Something is keeping them together. All those different points of view, all those different starlingnesses are at work, but something is keeping them together. And that's what I want to call pleasure, this very profound form of attention. And there's something I want to say about that, okay, and this is sort of why I want to give that talk, this talk. I think pleasure is an incredibly powerful, incredibly profound form of attention. It's also extremely fragile, and you can disrupt its game really easily if you ask for something back too quickly, which I think is what that teacher did that day, asking those children to listen for my wow words and my connectives. It's got to be, because pleasure, I think pleasure can't be taught. Pleasure is a gift. Pleasure is something that you share with people. It's not something you teach, it's something that you share. When your dad wants you to play football, he doesn't say, let's go in the garden, we'll work on general fitness, spatial ability, spatial awareness. Then, if you get to a certain point, we'll go in, we'll talk about the history of the Football League, the offside rule, that'll be great. And then in a few years' time, if you're any good, we'll have a kick around. You start with the kick around. You start with the pleasure. You start with the pleasure of his company. In fact, it's important that you're rubbish at it. I think it's very important that you're rubbish at it because it helps you to appreciate people who are good at it. So you start with the pleasure. But I think you can diminish the pleasure by asking for something in return. And particularly in schools now, I think children are very, very aware of league tables and SATs and how schools measure up against each other. When you ask a kid for a piece of work now, they know that you're not entirely asking for themselves, that the school has got to succeed as well, and that there's something transactional in that relationship. And that can be very, very... I know that there are things that have to be taught and have to be measured and have to be weighed. But I'm arguing for a space where something isn't weighed, measured, taught, where something is given and something is shared. I came across this fantastic quotation, if I can find it, from Neil Gaiman, and a great writer. Neil Gaiman said, "Stories you read when you're the right age never leave you. You will forget who wrote them. You will forget what the story was called. You'll forget exactly what happened. But if it touches you, it will stay with you and haunt the places in your mind that you rarely visit." And I've found that to be extremely true. And if you read the lives of great scientists, you will also find that to be true, that these ideas that are given are allowed to settle in your brain. But if we're asking kids to give something back straight away, then it doesn't really get that time to settle. If it's transactional, it doesn't stay. They've paid the ride, and therefore the ride is over. We have to make a space in the curriculum, in our lives, in the lives of our colleges and schools, to give the gift, to share the pleasure. And for me, the great powerhouse of that pleasure is reading. And it's kind of the most important pleasure, for very specific reasons, I think. Professor Pillay talked about our digital age, and I love the digital age. I love Wikipedia. I feel that Wikipedia is an organ in my body. It's a fantastic thing. But it's amnesiac, Wikipedia. No, that's not the right word. It has a short-term memory, Wikipedia. Here's the thing. Look up medieval African monarchies in Wikipedia. You'll get a page, right? Look up Pokemon, and you'll get a page on every single Pokemon character. Wikipedia is the great example of the tyranny of the present, the tyranny of now. And only reading will allow you to speak to the past. That's a really, really important thing, I think. I mean, in every way. I'm just thinking of to give you the most recent example that I can think of. What's playing in your multiplex now is the Hunger Games. What is the Hunger Games? It's Theseus and the Minotaur. And it's even Theseus and the Minotaur relayed by Mary Renault, the most uncool thing you could possibly think of, a 50s historical ladies' novel. But it's suddenly become this sort of, it goes on, it gets added to. Because if we engage with the past like that, there's a beautiful Tuscan saying, I think it's Tuscan, Umbrian saying, the tale is not beautiful until it's added to. That we have to pass these on and we bring something of ourselves to it each time. And the other important thing, I think, about reading, about books, speaking as someone who's worked in film and worked in television, worked in theatre, and worked in the Olympics opening ceremony, only in books. All those things, that films, plays, they're all fantastic. They're all wonderful television. I love it. It's fantastic. But only a certain type of person thrives in those media environments. People who are affable, people who are a bit cunning, people who can take it, people who are articulate, inevitably people who are middle class. They're the voices that speak loudest in those worlds. A book, on the other hand, can be written by anybody. The most important books in our history have been written by slaves, by people in prison, by people who could barely talk to other people, people who were really, really dysfunctional, and people who have a completely different kind of functionality. It's only in books do we get that multiplicity of voices. I think one of the great lessons from Jeremiah is that great ideas almost always come from the margin. And it's only in books do we hear those voices from the margin. And a voice from the margin that I particularly love, and I'm going to quote her on this subject, is Helen Keller. Do people remember Helen Keller? Helen Keller was blind and deaf and lived her childhood in this absolute furious silence because nobody could reach her. And she said, "Literature is my utopia. Here I am not disenfranchised. No barrier of the senses shuts me out from the sweet, gracious discourse of my friends. They talk to me books talk to me without embarrassment or awkwardness." And it's not just about her hearing something, it's about her giving something. If you read Helen Keller, I really recommend that you read Helen Keller, who is a great socialist, a great feminist, a fantastically eloquent Christian, a really complex voice. No one has ever written about smell the way Helen Keller writes about smell. Amazing. You'll appreciate your sense of smell so much the better. She says beautiful, beautiful things. She says, it's inconvenient, she said, to be blind, but it's so much worse to have no vision. She said of dying, it's just going into the next room, but in the next room, for me, the light will be on. These amazing things, right? I love Helen Keller. So in the spirit of sharing, I'm winding up now. In the spirit of sharing, because I said, we need to share things and not put too much program. I'm sharing this photograph with you. Can you all see this photograph? It's a photograph of Charlie Chaplin can you see this? Right. And it seems to be Charlie Chaplin, who again had his own journey. Charlie Chaplin, do people know this? Charlie Chaplin's first appearance on stage was when he was 5 years old, when his mother, who was a musical singer but also a terrible drunk, was booed off stage. And the manager saw Charlie in the wings and said, "You get on and you cover for her." So he went on and he performed in place of his mother. So his great impulse is love, to cover for his mother. That's how Charlie Chaplin started. And this is a picture of Charlie, who was brought up in a workhouse and who, by the time he was 20, was probably the most famous person that there's ever been. And this is him apparently being touched up by a slightly taller woman, which is one of his favourite activities, him being caressed by a slightly taller woman. And it's a fairly ordinary photograph of Charlie until you know that this woman is Helen Keller. And what she's doing in this photograph is seeing him with her fingers. That's her seeing Charlie Chaplin's face for the first time. I find that an incredibly moving photograph. I don't really want to say too much about it. I just want to share it with you. I think one of the reasons that I find it so amazing is that this is a woman who lived all her life in silence. And this is a man who made silence into poetry and comedy and tragedy and politics, all out of silence. I just think there's something amazingly powerful about that physical contact between the two of them. I really just want to leave the picture with you. But I want to say something about books as well, because Helen Keller's parents read Dickens, and they read American Notes for General Circulation. And by reading American Notes for General Circulation, they found out about a method for teaching profoundly deaf people to hear with their fingers. And so they kind of got in contact with the people who were mentioned in Dickens's book. John Logie Baird is in this story. But also Helen's teacher, who I've got aphasia about her name, Anne Sullivan. Did someone say Anne Sullivan? Right. But also Anne Sullivan, who came and stayed with the Kellers and tried to teach Helen to hear, or tried to teach Helen what language was, by giving her a doll in one hand and playing the word for doll into her other hand over and over and over and over again. And Helen Keller by this time was this ball of fury and anger, and she hated this, and it was draining for Sullivan, until the day that she took her over to in the farm, took Helen Keller over to the pump and pumped water onto her hand for 15 minutes while playing the word for water into her hand until it clicked. We talked about inspiration. Finally it clicked, and as Helen Keller says, she baptized me into language. And in that moment, Helen Keller ran around the farmyard, touching things and putting her other hand out and wanting to know the name of them. All morning, to the point where Anne Sullivan, who was a strong lass, was physically exhausted. She ran around, she wanted to know the name of everything. I find that's another 15 minutes that I like to think about. It's an amazing, amazing moment, because in that moment, Helen Keller is Adam in Eden, wanting to, greedy for the names of everything. Fantastic thing. And, of course, we've all been Adam in Eden when we were babies. That's that morning that Helen Keller had when she was, I don't even know, she was 7 or 8 years old, something like that. She's, in memories, a morning that she could remember. We've all experienced that, because that's what it's like being a baby, isn't it? When you're a baby, you wake up and you go, oh my God, grass, sky, mum, Weetabix. Peppa Pig. It's just like, whoa, everything's too much. And she experienced that as virtually a grown-up. And of course, we've also, anyone who's had children, experienced that moment as the Anne Sullivan moment, the parent moment, when we've given and given and given the names of things. So that's all in this photograph, which I'm sharing with you. And I'm going to end by reading you Helen Keller's quote about Anne Sullivan. She said, "Once I knew only darkness and stillness. My life was without past or future, but one little word from the fingers of another dropped into my hand, which had clutched at emptiness, and my heart leapt to the rapture of living." Okay. So I wish you the rapture of living. There you go.
Vice-Chancellor, colleagues and friends, this evening it has been a delight to welcome Professor Frank Cottrell Boyce to Liverpool Hope as our new Professor of Reading Communication. His lecture on Where Do Great Ideas Come From has been, I think, insightful and enlightening, demonstrating Professor Cottrell Boyce's skills as an internationally acclaimed scriptwriter, author and storyteller. It is, of course, the ability to tell stories and engage with the audience is the test of any good author, as well indeed as any good academic. We need to enchant, excite and inspire our audience. Professor Cottrell Boyce brings with him the ability to do this and will significantly enhance our students' experience of university life. It's a great pleasure to acknowledge one of Liverpool's own sons, and one who's contributed to the vibrancy of Liverpool's cultural, creative and literary life. Professor Cottrell Boyce was born and brought up in this city. He studied English at Keble College in Oxford, and those early influences are evident in his wide-ranging literary interests, which inspire his work. I think we've heard some of those inspirations already this evening. However, coming from Liverpool gives him a great advantage when he's dealing with humour or pathos, as Liverpudlians or Scousers has always had an ability to cope with adversity and understand the human condition. It's little wonder then that Professor Cottrell Boyce was able to contribute, as Professor Newport highlighted, to shows such as Coronation Street in the 90s and Brookside in the early 80s. In drawing on these experiences and understandings of life in northern post-industrial cities and towns, it's easy to see his inspiration, as well as to see the emergence of more universal themes in his work. My colleague, Professor Newport, has already mentioned some of the major contributions Professor Cottrell Boyce has made, so I won't go over those. But I would like to maybe stress some of the influences that come out in his work. And in particular, I think we should be very aware of the interweaving of faith and film, which is evident in much of his screenwriting and stories. As he notes in many of his online interviews, faith has been central to his life and apparent from his early childhood. He's a practicing Catholic, and I think not ashamed to say so. He tells the story of going to a cinema that later became a church, and the confusion this leaves in his mind. I will leave you to contemplate the possibilities here. Popcorn or confession? He notes in the end, I think the biggest thing my faith has given me is a strong idea of why I'm doing this. I had a quote from Jesse Owens, the great athlete, the greatest athlete over my desk. We always ask what do writers have in their rooms. Well, we know now here. He said his job is to point out what is good, to showcase what is good, so that people can know that life is good. And I suppose when we look at more recent activities, Professor Cottrell Boyce in particular gave the inaugural Newman lecture last year, a footling little parson, the greatest of English prose writers, at the Notre Dame University in London. The lecture series is a legacy of the papal visit to the UK when the Pope Benedict XVI came and beatified Cardinal John Henry Newman. He's most recently, as we noted, been scripting the opening events of the Olympic Games, a task that's clearly consumed much time and I suspect will give us a lot of pleasure when we see those opening events. Something possibly we need in terms of inspiration in our times. He's also recently found himself back working on the film, as he noted, The Railway Man. We look forward to its release in the near future. At Liverpool Hope University, we are delighted that Professor Cottrell Boyce has agreed to become part of our university and part of our community. He brings to the university his expertise as a screenwriter, author of numerous books, and indeed a social commentator. His commitment to supporting reading and communication are evident in the title of his appointment, which is shared between the faculties of Arts and Humanities and Education. Indeed, my colleague, Professor McGettrick, could easily have given this lecture, and we both very much welcome him to the university. It's also evident in his support for the Reader organisation and his commitment to supporting children to read. In a recent article in The Observer, Professor Cottrell Boyce suggested we should never lose sight of the pleasure that children get from reading. This is an important point and one that should be not lost in a university environment and indeed in a city such as ours. Professor Cottrell Boyce will be contributing to not one but two faculties then, working across arts and humanities and education. He had previously worked with a number of colleagues in education and will be familiar with what they do. In my faculty, he will be joining a Department of Politics, History, Media and Communication. In the latter case, we had in the last 2 years undertake a thorough review of our curriculum in this department. Under the guidance of the new head of department, Professor Michael Mulqueen, who joined us from Ireland, we've challenged the desire to chase new media technologies and indeed practice-based programs. We've gone back to fundamentals and asked, how should we go about forming our students? We want our students to be able to ask key questions and challenge prevailing wisdoms. We want our graduates in media and communication to be able to reflect on the profound social, moral, political and economic questions that modern societies face today. It is then very good to know that Professor Cottrell Boyce raises similar questions in his screenwriting and books, challenging indeed the traditional models, formulas and endings. In closing, may I once again welcome Professor Cottrell Boyce to Liverpool Hope University and thank him for his contribution tonight. May I also thank you for coming to this inaugural lecture and the important event in the life of not only Liverpool Hope University, but I think in the city of Liverpool. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean, and it's a great delight again to be able to have you all at the campus. And judging from your applause, one can be sure that you found the lectures inspiring as I found it. probably it's a confession time, in the context of the chapter, one of the things I do before my PA starts with the daily treadmill, and she sets off as I come in, is to come in a few minutes to read some classical text. And by taking those few minutes and reading a few delicious paragraphs, sometimes not even pages, I managed to work through Thomas à Kempis's work last year. And this morning I'm coming to the end of Augustine's Confessions. And this morning's episode was him remembering his mother who had just died, his extraordinary mother. And he remembers, as he tries to pay respects to her, how they came on their way back to Africa. They come to Rome from the North Milan, and they lean on a ledge looking out at the garden. And she has just died, and remembers how leaning on that ledge, they both talked together and tried to make sense of what life after we die would feel like or look like. And they spend those delicious moments reflecting on the now. And he says they began to see how it could be. And there was something transcendent. And then it passed, and they began just talking again. And just those few moments, he felt they were closer to what it could be, and it was transcendent. Ideas and academic work, in the end, is very much like that. After we've published the articles and marked the exams and passed students to get another graduation, what really makes us as academics transcend the humdrum of it all is, of course, ideas that sometimes dawn in the ways our lecture this evening described them. And the greatest joy of all, the greatest pleasure of all, is to enjoy ideas, which is what holds us together as a university. And of course, in the end, when we encounter real pleasure and real joy, we encounter something more transcendent than the getting and spending and laying waste our powers that occupies us. I'm delighted to hear your critique of competition, especially at this time when all around us, including government policies, force us into competition and the commodification of education and this market they're keen to create, arguing that competition will lead to quality. And all of us who got a glimpse of what you meant today, Professor, knows how wrong that is. When we can be freed from that kind of mindset, we have an idea, perhaps, of what being a true university is. So I'm very grateful. I've also not heard such a sharp critique of the presentism of Wikipedia before. Thank you very much. And of course, what a great storyteller you are, because none of us would go past Otter's Pool again without remembering the young man who dared to observe. Thank you so much for the lecture, and welcome to this community. It is our custom to give you a little memento of the evening. Would you please come forward and receive it? It's not the Oscar you're going to be receiving. I have no doubt about it. But remember, well, thank you very much for coming, and good evening.